What is VO2 max for anybody that doesn't know?
Your maximum ability to bring in and utilize oxygen. Cardiovascular fitness, if you want to think about it like that. When you compare leg strength in those same studies, depending on the studies, it's comparable, if not higher of a predictor than the VO2 max.
Can't I just think about that when I get older? Because a lot of people, I'm 30 years old.
Great question. You can. You're welcome to. But here's what happens. We know that VO2 max will drop something like 1% per year after the age of around 40 to 45-ish, right? Now, you can ameliorate or attenuate a lot of that.
Sorry, it will drop automatically?
Yeah, with aging.
Okay.
For sure.
Regardless of what obviously my work will go against it.
Yes.
But if left alone, it kind of drops itself.
Not even if left alone. We actually did a study years ago in Stockholm, Sweden, where we ran VO2 max tests on cross-country skiers. And these people were world champions in the 1940s and 50s. And they were still competing in 2010. So they're on year 50, 55, 60 of continuous training and competing. It's really, really cool to get these people in there. Like, again, you're studs in the 1950s and they haven't stopped competing. And we compared them to age-matched individuals in back here in the States. Now, all these people were over 80. Some of them were up to 92 years old. And we ran their VO2 max test. And there's a bunch of fun stuff we did there. But when you look at the VO2 max, our group average was something like 35, 38 milliliters per kilogram per minute. Those people, we didn't have their data from the 1940s. But if you're going to win a world championship in cross-country skiing, you're probably going to be in the 80s or 90s for your VO2 max. So they were way up there in the 80s or 90s, presumably when they were in their 20s and 30s. We're down to the mid-30s, 50 years later. But people their age that don't train, typically on average, VO2 max is about 20. So it is way higher with training. The slope, in terms of the decrease, can really be blunted, but it will still go down. You'll never see an 80-year-old who can outrun a 30-year-old if they're equivalently trained and talented, right? So it goes down. The same thing will happen with muscle strength and muscle size.
How is this linked to mortality, though? What is it about my VO2 max that ends up, putting me in a grave?
Yeah. So here's what happens. When men cross below 18 milliliters per kilogram per minute, for women, it's about 15 to 16. It's what we call the line of independence. And what that means is basic tasks of everyday living represent so much oxygen utilization that you can't do anything. As an example, if your VO2 max is 15, things like getting dressed in the morning are about 12. Okay. Getting up from the toilet, 12 or 13. Walking, 14, 15. You imagine doing a workout where you're literally at your maximum heart rate, just walking up your stairs. You shut down, right? And so what happens is it's multifaceted. Number one, cardiovascular, your heart is just no longer fit, right? The amount of blood pressure and the amount of stress your heart is under all day, just surviving, is enormous. So what do you think happens to your HRV? What do you think happens to your sleep? What do you think happens to your Goldberg? It's a very stressed physiology. It gets worse than that, though. You tend to stop doing things. So you socially isolate. You stop being around people. You stop having purpose and drive because you can't do anything. Mental health can decline because you don't feel like you're worth anything. So self-worth goes really low because you can't do anything by yourself. You can't even make your own breakfast. You can't. And so you start to just and so this thing just catapults. So it is a again, multifaceted problem. You can talk about just the ability to, you can't bring in and utilize oxygen. You can't fuel your brain. You start to deteriorate. But then you can go all the way to the other end of the spectrum that I just said of social isolation because you can't walk, you can't be in the world. You can't get out in the sunlight. You can't, physical activity starts to plummet once leg strength. Leg strength specifically will tell you how long you'll be physically active. Once your legs get weak, you stop being physically active because everything gets really, really darn hard. So you're like, I'm not even gonna go for a walk. Why? Because I'm gonna be exhausted because my legs are gonna be shaking because my legs are so weak. So you tend to stop, you tend to sit, you tend to not want to move, and then all those other problems exist. And now what we call this is atrophy leads to atrophy. So atrophy is a loss of muscle. But now because we're weaker, we want to do less things, which makes it worse and worse, and we just spiral down. So not ever getting into that cycle is critically important. So why can't you wait until you're old? First of all, trainability is still really high. We've done training studies on people 80 years old. You can grow muscle and strength at 80. No question. In fact, almost as well as you can when you're in your 20s. But if you're starting at a VO2 max of 35 when you're 40 years old, how long until you cross below 20? Well, 1% per year, you can run the math there pretty quickly. You're going to cross that line of independence by 60, 65. And now I guess you can start working out. But right, really, really challenging. Alternatively, you drive it as high as possible now. So when you see that decline over time, your buffer is much higher. Last point I'll make, I'm sure you got 100 questions there. If you run that gamble and you get to 50 and you have any little thing go wrong, you got to have a hip replacement. You got to have something going on. And now you're bedridden for 6 weeks. Boom, you just fall off the cliff. You get really busy at work. You got to take care of your mom, who now all these things that happen in real life, and you can't work out as much. Great. So the way that we say this, like one of the golfers I work with, John Rahm, we were talking about this a couple weeks ago, so I bring it up. And he was like, yo, look, one of the strategies is we always control the things we can control. So there are parts of the golf game that you can't control, the weather and what your opponents are doing. And so he always makes sure he gets really good at the things he can physically control. I would say the exact same thing right here. If you have the time right now, and there's never a good time, but you can control it, you can work out, you have the ability, then you want to put that as high as possible, because when things then come out of your control and you get hurt or work, or all the gyms in the world shut down, like, all these things that can happen, then you've got some buffer. But if you got no buffer, you're running a pretty high risk, and you're running a risk of losing your health, which means you're not gonna be able to do anything.
It reminds me of a conversation I had at Christmas with a dear relative of mine who, to scene set of Christmas, we've got 3 little kids below the age of 6 running around, which are my brother's kids. We've got all the generations there.
Cool.
And then we've got the oldest generation, and a member of that generation isn't able to move for many of the reasons you've described anymore. There's not an injury there, but just going up the stairs even will make them out of breath. And we sat down as a family at Christmas trying to figure out whether this was reversible or not. And, and we all concluded, again, being optimists and loving this person very much, that in fact it was a part of a downward spiral. And this individual had kind of accepted that it was their fate. They said, like, they'd blamed it on something that was unchangeable. And I was there on YouTube trying to find videos to prove that, if you start, I'll get you an exercise bike, and if you start moving, it can change.
There's extensive evidence to show you're right.
Okay, good.
Tons. Again, you can look at any of our work or any other groups of scientists that have done training studies in untrained 70-year-olds, men, women, 80-year-olds plus. There's actually, the reason I'm saying 80s because of a study that came out I think it was last year, the year before, on that. Strength training in 80-plus-year-olds that are not currently active. Huge improvements in strength, muscle growth. Like I can't remember the exact one, but I think it was like over 15% increase in muscle size. Like numbers that matter. So yeah, you absolutely, you could pick your study. You would have dozens to pick from that would show work. Now, can you get that person to do it?
That's the hard part.
That's the ultimate hard
But a lot of
part.
it starts with it even believing it's possible, which most people don't believe it's possible. They think once you get to 60, it's kind of an inevitability and there's nothing I can do to change it.
Yeah, absolutely fundamentally not true. In fact, if you look at the papers that have been done on the rate of decrease, I don't remember the exact numbers right now, but it's stunning what percentage of physiological decrements are stopped entirely. Like specifically with VO2 max, your VO2 max will remain highly stable. The kind of number we always play with is 50 at 50, which is at 50 years old, I want your VO2 max to be at least 50. If you train consistently, you'll see tons of people who, I remember I said earlier, it tends to start dropping around 45 to 50. You'll see people who do not drop into their 60s from their 20s if they consistently train. And that is a very real phenomenon. So you have a huge control over it. The earlier you start, the better. But if you've already missed that window, it's no problem whatsoever. Your ability to change really never stops in response to exercise. Plasticity in tissue is extraordinarily high, and it responds very well to training. And there's just No reason to think you can't make huge progress at any age.
What kind of training for VO2 max? I understand leg strength. I can kind of figure out what I need to do there, but to improve my VO2 max, what do I need to be doing?
Yeah, think of a couple of things. You need to challenge your heart to pump consistently over time. What that means is, if you want to think about that as lower intensity, more continuous work, that's great. The mode, running, swimming, cycling, pushing a sled, doing a circuit, joining a group activity class, those things don't matter that much in terms of they all work. Great. So something that makes your heart rate elevated for, let's just call it 20 minutes minimum, somewhere between 20 and 60 minutes. So if all you can do is 20, let's start at 20. No problem. What zone should you be in? I don't care. What heart rate? I don't care. Elevated. Great. I'll take that as a win. That's all I need. Then we need to do something that requires your heart rate to get closer to max. What heart rate? It doesn't matter. Go up high. I would bank on those two things. Something that is a lower intensity, longer duration, and then something that is a higher intensity, shorter duration. If you want to do something like 30 seconds as hard as you can and 30 seconds of rest for 4 to 6 rounds, great. No problem there, right? If you want to do something that's a little bit different, if you want to not even worry about that, and again, go to a group activity class, go to a spin class, go to a kettlebell circuit class. Great. You want to go to cardio kickboxing. All that's going to, fine, great. That alone will check the boxes off for a lot of people. So when you think about this, people get, like as an exercise scientist, people get way too caught up in like the specific protocol, how many reps exactly. When you ask a question like, how do I improve my VO2 max? Specificity always matters towards the end. But at the highest level, it's like, just get your heart rate up. There's a principle in science we call SAID, S-A-I-D, specific adaptation to imposed demand. That is to say, if your physiology is challenged, it will adapt. That's all it has to be. If you want your heart to improve, just challenge it. That's as complicated as we have to be. You do that consistently, ideally, you overload it a little bit,